and James Evans. And we will be your hosts this afternoon. We'll also be with our fellow team members, Michaela, Grace, Brian Xiao, Ray Chen, Roger Zhu, and Isabella Park. Alex Sweet, who is also part of our team, but unfortunately he was unable to join us for this panel. We are part of the program BranchOut. BranchOut is a nonprofit organization with Veritas education leaders that was co-founded by Dr. Yushin Wu and Mr. Richard Lang in 2015 and grew from 20 student volunteers to over 500 volunteers in 5 short summers. Our high school student mentors come from over 40 different schools across 4 states.
We started out as a peer STEM mentoring program working at community centers, homeless shelters, and county summer credit recovery programs, and have expanded into a community outreach program to promote cross-cultural understanding by featuring community heroes, creating research articles, and organizing career panels. As an award-winning community engagement system, we have received endorsement from U.S. Congress, including Senator Tim Kaine and former Congresswoman Barbara Comstock. Additionally, our innovator program won the U.S. Congressional App Challenge Award in 2019.
And as part of BranchOut's goals to promote civic engagement, community, and STEM education, we are very excited to be presenting this informative career panel. Environmental science has been an important field in modern society, and it is only growing ever more important. One of our featured panelists who will be speaking for us today is Dr. Thomas Miller from the University of Maryland. He is a professor of fishery science and the director of the Chesapeake Biological Laboratory. He has a PhD in zoology, a master's degree in ecology, and a bachelor's degree in human and environmental biology. He has received the President's Award for the Application of Science at the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science, as well as multiple awards from the University of Maryland for outstanding service.
Our second speaker will be Dr. Matthew J Ike. Dr. Eick is a professor at Virginia Tech, teaching a variety of environmental science courses and researching chemical reactions at the mineral-water interface. He has a PhD in environmental soil chemistry, a master's degree in soil chemistry, and a bachelor's degree in agronomy. He has received multiple awards from Virginia Tech for outstanding service and other high awards from various other academic organizations.
We are thrilled to have you all with us this afternoon, and I'm sure you all will provide excellent information regarding this industry for all of us. Audience members will have the opportunity to ask questions for our panelists at the end.
That being said, before we start our panel, we asked all the audience members with questions to please put them in the chat box now. And as said, towards the end of the panel, we will read them aloud and they will be answered.
All right, so let's start and kick off our panel. So our first question for our 2 panelists are, why did you choose to go into environmental science and why did you find it intriguing?
I suppose Dr. Miller can go first.
Okay, well, thank you. First of all, let me say it's a delight to be here today, and I'm always excited to talk to the next generation of environmental leaders. So why did I choose to go into environmental science? Growing up, I always wanted to be a vet, and I decided against being a vet after watching several All Creatures Great and Small episodes that involved helping cows give birth, and I decided that that wasn't the career for me. But I'd always had a love and a passion for the aquatic environment, so for rivers and lakes and the ocean. And so I followed my interest without, I admit, a clear career path. If you had told me when I was sort of 16 growing up in London that I would spend a career in academics, I would spend a career advising federal, state, and international bodies on how to manage fisheries, which is my research area, I would have been amazed, because at the age of 16, I had no idea what careers were available. So I followed my heart, I followed my passion, and I have absolutely no regrets over the career that I've followed. So Matt?
For me, I didn't really choose environmental science. Environmental science kind of chose me. I majored in agronomy at Virginia Tech as an undergraduate. I thought that I would pursue more of a career related to agriculture. I took a soil chemistry course and kind of fell in love with that, and then went on straight on for a master's degree in soil chemistry at University of Delaware. After that, I had no idea I would ever work in academia. I was in the Peace Corps for several years, and then I moved to Atlanta, Georgia. I was in search of a job, and I started looking in the environmental consulting and engineering industry, and was able to get a job in that arena. After a couple of years, I decided that wasn't for me, and had an opportunity to actually go back to school and pursue my PhD at University of Delaware. And even after that, I didn't think I would go into academia, but I kind of out-educated myself for the environmental engineering consulting industry, and I was in desperate need of a job, and I applied for an assistant professorship at Louisiana State University and was able to get that position. And after several years there, I had the opportunity to go back to Virginia Tech, be an advisor to their environmental science undergraduate program, and also teach environmental science, environmental soil chemistry, and run study abroad programs overseas related to the environment. And I've been here ever since, and absolutely love the career that I chose, or that chose me, excuse me.
Thank you so much for the response. Our second question is, please describe your role at your institution and the details of your work.
So I am the director of a marine research laboratory. There is a long tradition of marine laboratories dating back to the 1860s or so in Europe, the 1890s in the US. And they are places of learning, and typically places of teaching as well. They were traditionally summer schools where people would come and learn about marine science, which wasn't at that point taught in universities, and so this was the only way of doing it. So as director of a laboratory off campus, I'm responsible for a staff of 110 people, managing 110 people. That's 30 faculty, about 30 support staff, and the rest are students and postdocs. My responsibilities involve teaching graduate students, mentoring my own graduate students, conducting their research, conducting my own research, and then managing the budget and the infrastructure itself of the institution. So in some ways, it's like being a boss of a small corporation, and I deal with everything from human resources to whether we replace a roof to the exact kind of experiments that students might do for their master's thesis or their PhD, to classroom teaching in a sort of more formal environment. Although I must admit, for the last year and a half, even our classroom teaching has looked much more like this than it has looked like traditional sort of classroom encounters.
So I'm a professor in the School of Plant and Environmental Sciences at Virginia Tech. My role is mainly advising undergraduate environmental science students, as well as teaching undergraduate courses in the environmental science program. I still have an active research component. I primarily look at nutrient and trace metal cycling at the mineral water interface and how it can influence the potential toxicity of trace elements such as arsenic and lead in soil environments. We have a large environmental science undergraduate program. We have close to 300 students. I advise the bulk of those students. So between my teaching and advising roles, my research really is my secondary component. I do usually have 1 or 2 graduate students, but again, my focus is on undergraduate advising and working to create a robust environmental science program for our environmental science students. Many of our students will go on to graduate school to pursue research related to the environment, but many also work in the environmental engineering and consulting industry. They work for nonprofits. They work for regulatory agencies such as the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality, the Environmental Protection Agency, as well as other government agencies. And we have one of the oldest environmental science programs in the country. It began in 1992, and we have over several thousand graduates in the program.
All right, next question. What did you do earlier on in life to reach this position in your respective institutions, like education, internships, etc.?
So as I think about my own career and probably the career of others that I know, the vast majority of them are not planned. They occur through sort of happenstance. So I took an undergraduate degree in biology, and that involved the full suite of sort of biological sciences. In the UK, you specialize very early, so I did nothing but biology for three years. I wasn't asked to study a broad curriculum. I left university not knowing what I wanted to do, and for a variety of reasons came to the US to do graduate work. And except for a short spell when I went back to the UK to teach high school students, have remained in North America ever since. So that involves a research-based master's degree, which took me a couple of years, a research-based PhD, which typically is sort of 4 years beyond that, postdoctoral training in Canada at McGill University, where I was on research cruises in the North Atlantic. So I've spent probably getting on for a year at sea in the North Atlantic sampling fish. And then I arrived at the Chesapeake Biological Lab in 1994 and have gone through the standard promotion since then. But that has involved an awful lot of diverse experiences, from months in the tropics to international travel, domestic travel, research on the Great Lakes, research in the North Atlantic, in the Chesapeake Bay. As I've become more senior, you take on more of an administrative role. So I've been director at CBL for a decade, and my research has been much reduced over that period because of the responsibilities to manage the program at CBL. So it's been an incredibly diverse, enjoyable, and unplanned career.
I have a similar experience to Dr. Miller as well. As I mentioned previously, my undergraduate degree was in agronomy, specifically soil science, and I went directly to University of Delaware to pursue a master's in soil chemistry, more from a nutrient standpoint and not an environmental standpoint. I then went on into the Peace Corps, and as I mentioned earlier, didn't think I would go back into academia and had to find a job, so I was able to find a job in the environmental engineering and consulting industry in Atlanta. After several years of working, I got a little bored with what I was doing, and my old advisor approached me and said, I was approached by NASA about writing a proposal to do research on lunar-based agriculture and lunar soils. So I thought this was really interesting. So I kind of rolled the dice and said, if the proposal gets funded, I'll go back for my PhD. And if it doesn't, I'll look for a job somewhere else in the consulting industry. I was fortunate that it got funded. And specifically what I was looking at was the release of chromium and nickel from lunar simulants. Unfortunately, NASA would not give me any real lunar materials, and it's a good thing. As a graduate student, I lost some of my lunar simulants to an accident. So if I did have the real material, I probably would have gotten in trouble from NASA. So I did that research. And again, as I mentioned, I needed a job upon graduating, and I was able to get a job at LSU. And I was fortunate because it was a teaching and research position there. I was there for 2.5 years. And without that experience, I would have never gotten the position at Virginia Tech. They were specifically looking for somebody to fill an advisory role, as well as to teach courses in the undergraduate environmental science curriculum. At that point in time, we had close to 600 majors in environmental science. So hence the impetus for hiring somebody in that advisory role, as well as teaching undergraduate environmental science courses. And since then, I've just gone through the promotion ranks. My role has changed somewhat, as I mentioned earlier. I'm doing a lot less research right now. It's more collaborative, more an administrative and teaching role with advising undergraduates in the environmental science program and teaching numerous courses related to the environmental science program.
Thank you for those really interesting insights. Our next question for you two is, how do you believe environmental science is crucial?
Well, I could start there. It's crucial because everything we need to survive is from the environment. So you all have heard of the term ecosystem services: fresh air, clean water, clean soil. All these things are necessary for us to survive as a species. So environmental science is extremely important because we need to understand and hopefully undo a lot of the damage that we're doing to the environment, so these ecosystem services will be available for future generations.
So I would reiterate what Matt said, and I would add to that. When I was your age, there were probably 6 billion people on the planet. There are now over 7.5 billion people on the planet. We're facing a warming climate that will place considerable stress on our natural systems, on our agricultural systems, on our societal infrastructure. We rely on the natural system to ameliorate lots of the climate change effects that we are seeing. And should that change, things will become exponentially worse. And so both understanding the natural system and developing ways in which we can better work with the natural system is essential, not only for my well-being in the coming years, but particularly for your well-being in the coming years. I think it is probably the most important field that there is currently.
Our next question is, what do you think is the most important aspect of your work?
I think actually that's a relatively easy question for me. The most important aspect of my work is the students that I've trained. I can go and I can advise the state of Maryland and the Commonwealth of Virginia about how to manage blue crab, for example. But that's just my impact. the students I've trained over my career are doing similar things around the US, around the world. And so the biggest impact that I have is in training the students. The biggest enjoyment that I have is in working with these incredibly bright people that Matt and I have the honor of working with as university academics, who are constantly pushing and challenging our understanding, constantly teaching us new ways of thinking and new ways of seeing the world that lead to deepening of our own understanding of our field. So for me, working with students is without a doubt the most important and most enjoyable thing that I do.
I agree with Dr. Miller. That's the most enjoyable thing I do, and also the most important. Not only teaching students in my basic environmental science class, educating them about the environment, seeing the lights go on, seeing how passionate they are about the environment and how they want to continue to work toward a better world. Also, advising our undergraduates is extremely important, seeing them mature from their freshman year to their senior year, keeping in touch with them upon graduation to see how their career paths evolve is the most important thing. And I think that for both myself and Dr. Miller, educating that next generation on the importance in the environment, whether it's from a graduate student standpoint or an undergraduate student standpoint, is the most important aspects of our work.
All right, thank you for your very your very insightful responses. Now, the next question is, please describe a typical day of work in your field at your institutions.
I can start on that one. Most days are really not typical because every day it's going to be different, depending whether a course request opens up or drop ed is ending, the end of the semester is going on. Something's always different is happening, but typically it would be coming to work. Normally I would have several advisees appointments during the day, prepping for teaching class, potentially working with one of my graduate students on a problem they may have, or getting in the laboratory to help teach them a new technique or something that they're struggling with. So typically it really involves working with my undergraduate students as well as graduate students, and specifically working with my advisees.
So I would say, sadly, for the last year and a half, a typical day for me looks much like this: a series of Zoom calls with people in little boxes who I don't get to meet. But as Matt said, one of the joys of this career is that there really isn't a typical day. It's a very, very diverse experience. So I could be in a meeting discussing our budget one day. I could be out on a research vessel on the Chesapeake Bay the next day. I could be in a lab the following day. So there really is no typical day. And I think one of the things that was certainly true early in my career, less true now, but early in my career, one of the joys of an academic is that to a great extent, you get to set your day. You get to determine when you do these different tasks. As you become more senior, the administrative burden and the requirement for administration becomes such that it does become a little more regimented and a little more fixed. But for a large part of my career, I got to decide what I did, when I did it, and how I did it. And that's a luxury that not many people have.
Thank you for your responses. our next question for you too is, what were some hardships you've encountered in your work and how did you overcome them?
So I told you I've spent a large amount of time at sea. I get violently seasick. It is the worst possible trait for a marine biologist. And at some point you just have to decide that you're going to work through it. And I think that sort of model of deciding something is important and finding ways to overcome that challenge is certainly the biggest lesson that I learned. The last cruise I took on the Atlantic, when that program finished, the captain of the research vessel brought me in and he said, "You know, I lost a lot of money on you." I said, "Really? Why?" He said, "Well, we all had bets on the first cruise who wouldn't make it to the last cruise. And I bet on you. And I thought for certain you would never make it through because you've been so ill." And that just reminded me that if you really do want something, you can typically find ways to overcome the challenges that you face. And often the harder those challenges are to overcome and the more work you have to put in to overcome them, the more meaningful the outcome.
Yeah, for me, unfortunately, it was the shooting incident on April 16th. So I'll just leave it at that. That was very difficult, not only from an individual standpoint, losing people you knew, but just from working with faculty and staff and students to try to mend, heal, and recover from that incident.
Thank you for your responses. Our next question is, what are your greatest successes? Describe them.
But for me, it really is the students. And I think that one of my greatest successes in terms of teaching are the study abroad and experiential learning courses that I teach. I conduct a study abroad to Ecuador over winter session, and we've been doing that for 8 years. Unfortunately, we couldn't go last year because of the COVID pandemic, but seeing the light bulb and the excitement of the students as we go through the Amazon rainforest, the high Andes Paramount, and Galapagos Islands, seeing students who thought they were going to do one career path, and then after a 3-week study abroad, that career path changes, getting letters from students upon graduation just to let me know that it was that study abroad that we conducted over winter that got them to what they were doing right now. And they really appreciate that opportunity to go on that trip and learn all the things we learn in those 3 different ecoregions. I think that's the most fulfilling and rewarding aspect.
So I would concur with that. I think in terms of a sort of deep personal satisfaction, it is seeing the success of your students and seeing the influence that you've had, and on those occasions when students reach back to recognize and thank you for that. And that really is extraordinarily fulfilling. One thing does stand out in my mind as a sort of a personal achievement. I was asked to give testimony up on the Hill, and walking into the Capitol building past a long queue of people waiting to get in, seeing your name checked off, and walking into the hearing room to give testimony in front of people you see on the news, was, I think, to me an indication of attainment in my career that resonated quite deeply with me, particularly because 200 years ago, my forebears had tried to burn the building down. So that cycle was something that was particularly meaningful.
All right. The next question is, how has your work and methods advanced over the course of your career?
So I'll pick on two types of technologies that have influenced my career, certainly. The first is one that you will only understand from reading, and that is the enhancement of computing capacity throughout my career has been astounding. You know, I have more computing power on my iPhone today than I ever did on the first computers that I worked on. And what that has allowed us to do in terms of developing models of how the ocean ecosystem changes and adapts and is impacted by human exploitation or human caused environmental change has been remarkable. And I think that will continue to be a significant event. The second thing related to that has been a much more recent development, and that's the development of autonomous underwater vehicles. On the news, you see a lot about drone technology, you know, delivering organs for kidney transplants or blood or pizzas, right? And it's clearly understood that drone technology is having a significant impact on society. Those impacts are just as profound in the aquatic realm, where these underwater vehicles are giving us ways to sense the environment that even 15 years ago we had no understanding of. And it allows us to understand patterns and processes in very new and very profoundly different ways. So those would be the two advances that I would point out from looking back at the beginning of my career to now.
And I'll concur with Dr. Miller on those assisted technologies, whether it's robotics in the field or drone technologies, both from an agricultural standpoint and environmental standpoint. They really allowed us to do much more in terms of precision agriculture, also monitoring plant pathogens, movements, and viruses, as well as from an environmental standpoint. For my research, primarily being laboratory based, I really look at things from a molecular standpoint. I probe that mineral water interface. So what I've seen over my career are the advancement in some of these spectroscopic and microscopic techniques, specifically synchrotron-based radiation spectroscopic techniques, such as X-ray electron or X-ray photoelectron spectroscopy, as well as some of the electron microscopes, the advanced units that have been developed right now. Really, I've moved a long way in allowing us to better understand what takes place at that mineral water interface and then better predict the potential release of contaminants as well as nutrients into the environment.
Thank you for those wonderful responses. Our next question for you is, how does ergonomics, or a science of efficiency in the workplace, play in your work?
Many of my colleagues would say efficiency doesn't play any role in my research at all. I think that this is an area that really hasn't yet impacted the research environment in terms of ergonomic efficiencies. The changes that have occurred are health and safety enhancements that have been significant in terms of training that people receive before they use instrumentation or chemicals, the personal protective equipment we're now supposed to use when we are in the lab or even at sea. And the other significant change has been increased oversight of animal use in research. So for me, fish fall under the same oversight that any vertebrate animal does. So we're governed by the same rules as if we were working on rats or sheep. And so there is a much higher level of oversight and a much deeper consideration of ethical issues of animal use in research than ever there was. But we still sit in the same uncomfortable bench stools. We're still leaning over fish tanks to do things. So that's something I think for the, ergonomics in general is something for the next generation.
I'll agree with Dr. Miller from a research standpoint. I really haven't seen that advancement, but I have seen it more in terms of student classrooms that are being built recently and development of some teaching laboratories. They seem to take more ergonomic vision in terms of helping the students become more comfortable. And we don't have these old standard desks that I used to have when I started here at college. So I've seen that advancement quite a bit, especially in a lot of the new classrooms, whether it's a teaching classroom or a laboratory classroom that are being built.
Thank you for the thoughtful responses. Our next question is, how does human relations or how people interact with each other play into your work?
So I would say that's at the core of almost everything that I do, and increasingly so in the last 5 years or so. So there's a common phrase for us in fisheries research is that we don't manage the fish, we manage the fishers. So the men and women who go out to collect and catch the fish. And we try to impose guidelines and rules about how many fish can be caught and how they can be caught. And there's constant innovation in the fishing communities to ensure the efficiency of their boats. And so if we don't engage with the fishing community regularly and consistently, our ability to control the nation's fishery resources is diminished greatly. I will say, in the last 5 years, but particularly in the last 2 years, the question of environmental justice has really risen to the front of most people's minds. So it can come up in lots of different areas. You can think about it from the Flint water crisis, where marginalized communities typically had lower drinking water quality than other communities. In my own area, immigrant communities and other marginalized communities often fish for food. So they'll be fishing along the Anacostia River in Washington, D.C., or the Middle Branch in Baltimore, and eating the fish that they catch when we know those fish often have high levels of contaminants. And so there is a very clear recognition, and it has grown in significance in the last few years, about the inequitable way in which society experiences the environment. And I think that focus will continue and only become greater in the coming years.
And I agree with Dr. Miller on that. From all aspects of environmental science, you see this environmental injustice, so to speak, whether it's minority communities near Los Angeles, living next to petroleum refineries, and having a much higher incidence of cancer than a community that lives further away. We see this throughout the United States. For me, the relationships aspect of my job is very important. I interact a lot with prospective students and their parents, especially during spring break, where a lot of students are going to visit colleges. So I spend a lot of time sitting down with parents and students and interacting with them and letting them know about the Virginia Tech Environmental Science Program and potential job opportunities out there. So that aspect of my job is extremely important. And it's one aspect of my job that I really enjoy, because as an undergraduate, I had great advisors and great mentors that kind of helped me get on the career path that I began. And I feel like I want to do the same thing for the students that are coming through this program, and assure the parents that we do have an outstanding undergraduate degree program here, and that we're going to take very good care of their students in our School of Plant and Environmental Sciences.
All right, thank you. Very thought-provoking responses. The next question will be, how do you think you have contributed to environmental science, or what do you most hope to achieve out of your work?
Again, for me, it's going back to those students that I influence, whether it's advising those students or teaching a student in environmental soil chemistry, where all of a sudden they become passionate about that subject and pursue graduate degrees, or whether it's conducting my study abroad to Ecuador and seeing the excitement in the students' eyes and how important that experiential learning experience is.
Yeah, I would concur with that completely. There have been papers I've written that have given me some degree of personal satisfaction, but if I think about where the impact is, it's the training of students, the motivating of young people to follow their own career paths, which may not look like mine, which may be quite different from mine, but that sort of impact far outweighs any individual impact that I can have.
And one of the things that I've done over my career, I've kept every thank you note, letter, email that I've gotten from any student that I've mentored or advised here at Virginia Tech. And anytime that I'm having a bad day or feeling a little bit sorry for myself or something like that, I open that folder and start looking through some of those, and it really changes my disposition quite rapidly.
Thank you for those insightful responses. Our next question for you too is, how do you believe general society perceives environmental science, and what do you think about that?
So I think society's perception of the environment is a very dynamic thing. So if you were to look in sort of recent history, you would have found a peak in the recognition of the role of the environment in the 60s and 70s, perhaps motivated by Rachel Carson's famous book, Silent Spring, where she imagined a world where the spring chorus of birds wouldn't occur because of pesticide impacts. And that interest has risen again. And I think there is a resurgence of recognition, particularly from young people such as yourselves, about the importance of sustaining, conserving, and restoring the environment so that people who come after us get to explore and see the wonder of the modern world, or of the natural world. We have, he may not be known too far outside of the rural county that I live in, but there's a former state senator in Calvert County called Bernie Fowler, who's now 95 years of age. When he wades into the Patuxent River every year in June, And he says, when I was a boy, I could wade in almost up to my neck and still see my white shoes. And he uses that as an index of how well we're restoring the environment. And what I see when I watch Bernie do these wade in is that there's this strong bimodal interest. There is passionate interest from young people who, first of all, want to connect with someone who remembers what things were like in the 1920s and 1930s for the environment, and recognize that a simple index, such as how far can he wade in and still see his shoes, is relevant and impactful. And then there's a group of older people, older even than Matt and I, who remember also what it was like. And so there is this sort of bimodal distribution. And I remain very hopeful because of the passion for the environment of people of your generation.
I agree with Dr. Miller. I see in my environmental science students and teaching my environmental science class that this younger generation is really passionate about the environment, and they want to undo a lot of the ills that we've created over the past several decades. But I also see in a large portion of the population as well, a kind of disconnect from the environment. And they don't really understand that how important the environment is to us. The planet can get along without us, but we can't get along without the planet. So I think especially in this technology-driven age, more people spend time inside, less people are going outdoors to really connect with nature and see how important the environment and ecosystem services are to us. So that's a little disheartening, but hopefully maybe through the pandemic and other things, people have gotten out a little bit more and are starting to realize how important the environment is to our overall health and well-being.
The responses were very inspiring. Our next question is, how has the pandemic affected your research or teaching?
It's and there was a question that in the chat talking about that too. For me, the research hasn't been affected that much. Again, I'm doing less research now in my career, but it's really affected my teaching and advising, and just experiencing the last 2 semesters where most of our courses were online. I miss that interaction with students. I miss talking to students face to face. I miss sitting in my office talking to my advisees, or taking a walk with my advisees over to the duck pond on a nice day if they have questions, and working with them and talking to them. So I've been struggling with that. I was fortunate that I was able to teach an in-person class because it was a smaller class last spring semester. But even then it was difficult, because if I have a student who's a junior or senior where 5 out of their 6 classes are online, I have to offer both an in-person class as well as an online version. Most of those students wouldn't come to class because they weren't on campus. So it didn't make sense to come to campus for one class. So that was very difficult. So overall, it's been a struggle. Virginia Tech is going back to all in-person classes fall semester. So I'm really looking forward to that and beginning to see my advisees face to face. Many of my freshman advisees that were assigned to me, I haven't seen them face to face since they arrived on campus at Virginia Tech.
So it probably has been slightly different for me. CBL is one of 4 research labs that form this University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science, and we teach in a graduate program that also includes the main campus at College Park, and UMES in Princess Anne, and UMBC in Baltimore. So even before the pandemic, we were doing a lot of our teaching over an interactive video network. So the change to Zoom has actually been rather transparent for our formal teaching. The research, however, has been heavily impacted, particularly the timing of the onset of the pandemic in March and April. That's a time when, you know, the ecosystems are beginning to wake up after being dormant in the winter. There were students who were planning sort of aggressive and extensive field campaigns to study, you know, crabs and oysters and wetlands, and whether that was in the Chesapeake Bay or the Arctic Ocean or the Pacific or the Atlantic, and all of that was stopped. And so many of our students and many of our faculty have lost an entire year of research productivity. And so that's been really hard. People who come into this field tend to be very driven. They tend to be somewhat of an overachiever, that they want to get as much done as they can, and to be this sort of enforced idleness of not being able to do research really has been a challenge for young faculty, for graduate students. And I think we'll see the impacts of it for a while yet.
All right, thank you for the informative responses. The last question that we will read before we go into the audience's questions would be, what advice would you give to someone interested in environmental science?
I would start with, I think, the very first comments I made is that you follow your heart and follow your head. I think life is too short not to follow your passions. And it is, it can be certainly, as you've heard, for Matt and I, extremely fulfilling careers. We are just the tip of the iceberg of what environmental science careers could include. You've heard from him about graduates from Virginia Tech working in a wide range of career paths. It's true for our graduates too, working in corporations, in government, in the not-for-profit sector, in the consulting sector. So there is a wide diversity of things that you can do under the broad umbrella of environmental science. And that's probably the biggest challenge, is that it is such a broad umbrella that knowing what training you want or need can be the biggest obstacle at the beginning. And you heard Matt speak about a particular graduate course in soil chemistry, I think it was, if I remember the story correctly, that excited him. I had a similar course, and I think when you follow your passions, you're going to come across those transformative experiences. And I would urge you all to have the courage to follow wherever that may lead.
And I agree with Dr. Miller. And one of the things I'll tell our undergraduates in environmental science, many of our students will take an environmental science class in high school and really be excited about that class and decide that's what they want to pursue as a career. And then they get to Virginia Tech, and there's a lot of science in our environmental science program. So there's a lot of chemistry and biology and calculus. But I always try to tell my students, if you're passionate about this, continue forward, even though you may be struggling a little bit. Don't take the easy way out, because many of our graduates, as I mentioned, there's a wide breadth of career opportunities. Many of our graduates are well prepared to go on to graduate school. I've talked to many of my former advisees that have gone on for masters and PhDs, and they said they felt much more prepared to enter graduate school than many students coming from other environmental science programs that didn't have a lot of the rigor of the science-based courses in there. So don't take the easy way out, and definitely follow your passion if that's something you're interested in. There's so many opportunities out there for employment, for graduate school and research, and a lot of different career opportunities.
All right, thank you, Dr. Miller and Dr. Ike. That was some truly valuable information and advice. At this point, we will read the audience's questions, of which there only appear to be two. So if any audience members happen to have any more questions, please put them in the chat box now. Okay, more coming in. So the first question is from Sarah Deller, and she asks, how large are the classes that you teach, and are you able to get to know your students well?
I teach several undergraduate classes. My freshman level environmental science class, which really is for non-science majors, as most of the students outside of the science field. I average about 125 students in the class per semester. My senior level environmental soil chemistry class usually is about 45 to 50. But in both those classes, I do try to get to know my students. I do have a lot of group work, so I'm able to walk around and talk to those students. We're fortunate with learning management systems and stuff. Often students' pictures are associated with their names. So what I often try to do at the beginning of the semester is to go through those pictures and try to put names with faces. It's difficult in a class with 125 students where those students are not my advisees, but I do make it an effort to get to know those students. In my environmental soil chemistry class, a lot of those students will be my advisees, so I already have that connection and interaction with them. But I definitely try to have that personal experience and relationship with students, because I think that makes a big difference in terms of the student's overall experience, especially at a large university like Virginia Tech.
So I would say, just from a teaching point of view, the most powerful weapon you have is knowing the student's name. And the more you can form a personal bond of some kind with the student, the more impact you have. We're lucky at CBL because we're a graduate program and our classes are much smaller than those that Matt's just described. So for me, a typical class is 6 to 10 students, and you really do get to know them and get to work with them quite closely during an entire term. And certainly for our individual research students, for graduate students that work in our labs, we work very closely with them for periods of 2 to 5 years, and you really do get to know each other remarkably well under those circumstances. I've had very profound discussions with young people on the tail deck of a research vessel at 2 o'clock in the morning when you're waiting for the next net to go out. So you do get to know people very, very well.
The next question was privately chatted to me, so I'll just ask it without saying the person's name. How long have you been doing your job?
I started last Tuesday. No, I've been doing this. I became a university professor in 1994. I went to my undergraduate campus in 1978. So effectively, I've been doing it. Gosh, if you add up the years, it's 50 years or so, right? Or 40 years or so. So it's been an entire career.
I'm similar to Dr. Miller. I began as a university professor in 1995 and began my undergraduate career in 1982. So it has been a long time, and it's gone by faster than I could ever imagine.
Given the time constraint, maybe we can take one more question from the audience. And I know some students ask really interesting questions, including the horse, Dr. Miller's background. They're really curious, right? So that's a really good question. But maybe one, from Layla, which is the last question here. What were your favorite subjects or classes in high school that led you to this field, or potentially?
So mine was chemistry because of the teacher I had. I had the same chemistry teacher from the age of 11 to 18, just because of the way schools are set up in the UK. He died shortly after I left school, and one of the honors of my life has been to go back to my school and give a lecture that's named after him. And so I'm not sure it's the topic you study necessarily or what's taught in the classroom. It's the passion, the concern, and the in his case the extremely demanding standard that he set. And that's I still use mental arithmetic tricks that he taught me when I was 12.
I had a similar experience. It was probably my 7th grade science teacher, Mrs. Whitaker. That's really what got me on the path of going into the science field. Back then, I was really interested in birds and did a lot of bird watching, and she even instilled that passion further in me. I never thought I would be a soil scientist / soil chemist. I always thought I was going to be an ornithologist when I went on to college, but it was probably her passion for the environment and her seeing that in my eyes. And she would take me birding at all hours in the morning, all over the state of New Jersey, me and another student in the class that were interested in that. And she's probably the one that got me interested in pursuing environmental science in the science field.
So having a good mentor, it's actually really important. Yeah, wonderful. Before we leave today, do you have any final advice or anything you want to share with the audience? We have mostly high school students here, but we also have some middle schoolers too.
Just as I mentioned earlier, if environmental science is an area that you're passionate about and really care about, I think just you need to pursue that and work hard. There are a lot of different avenues and areas that you can get a job in or go into graduate school to pursue research. And I think it's really extremely important that we have more and more students involved in this field as we move forward.
I would agree with that wholeheartedly. Any experiences you can gain are advantageous, even if they ultimately lead you to saying, no, that's not the field for me. I think it is really, as we both said, I think really important to explore your passions, to let your enthusiasm guide you. And if you do that, you can't go wrong. It may not be the path you thought you would be on, but you can't go wrong.
Thank you so much. I personally learned a lot today, and yeah, team, why don't you do our final closing speech?
All right, so that would be all the time that we have for the questions. And on behalf of the whole BranchOut career panel team, we hope that everyone has enjoyed the panel this afternoon and learned a great deal about successful individuals in the field of environmental science. We hope that everybody got a chance to experience this essence of the field, had their questions answered, and maybe even be inspired to pursue or learn more about this industry. Environmental science has been an important contributor to the world and will continue to be for many generations to come.
We are also extremely appreciative of the panelists, Dr. Thomas Miller and Dr. Matthew J Ike, for their time and giving us such great insight into this field. We are also very appreciative of our audience members for making this panel go so great and asking some wonderful questions. To learn more about BranchOut and for future panels, please check us out at www.velbranchout.org or on Facebook at Veritas Education Leaders. We look forward to seeing you at our next event.
Thank you so much.